This is an interview with Dr. John Dancey, who has been a resident of the Aylmer area all his life and had his veterinarian practice here. The interview is being conducted by Karen Stafford at Mr. Dancey's home on August the 9th, 1983. Dr. Dancey, could you please tell me when and where were you born?
I was born in 1914, right here.
And could you outline your family background for us?
Well, you mean my ancestors, the people who actually came to Canada originally?
Yes.
Well, the first Dancey came here in 1822, and that was Dr. Edward Dancey, who was buried in the cemetery across the street. And he settled originally in a little place between Aylmer and Port Bruce, and then he came to this area down here and accumulated property. This is lot 22 and 23, concession 6 and 7 of Malahide. And he, when he arrived in New York, he was with his sister, Margaret Livingston. The Livingstons were originally Scottish people who had, at the time of Bonnie Prince Charlie, had been forced to flee to Ireland. And Margaret Livingston, of course, was his sister, and he was approximately 16 years old when he arrived in New York, and he came to Canada in 1822, which would make a period of apparently 6 years, and in that period he received his medical degree. Now, he is, I believe it was 1842, it became necessary that all practicing physicians in Ontario passed the board examinations, and he is listed as being a successful candidate in 1843 in Toronto. Now, I'm not too sure about some of these facts that I'm going to tell you, because over the period of years I believe that he had 3 fires, and during these fires, of course, many of his records were lost. One thing that did survive was a picture that was painted in the I presume in the 1860s. Now, this is an oil painting done in a exceptionally wonderful manner, and with the attention to detail, and such as you can see by the studs and whatnot, and the fingers, nails, and the creases in their face, and so on, and the hair. Now, the story, this picture, by the way, is about 4 feet high, and about 30 inches, about 30 inches wide, and possibly 3 feet wide. It is with my nephew, Dr. John Dancey, in Corner Brook, Newfoundland at this time. We have a photo of it here, which I'll show you. Now, the story is that at the time that this was painted, 2 young Englishmen were down and out, and they were apparently, as they say now, on the lam from England for some reason or other, but they were aristocratic people, well educated, and they latched on to Dr. Dancey as the easy mark, and they intended to winter with him. Well, they did winter for a period, but he became a little put out that he should have to feed him and wine him and whatnot with no recompense. So he told them that they'd have to get out and do something. So they said that they would do a painting of he and his son, Benjamin, who became my grandfather. Now, Benjamin at that time was about 14 years old, as you can see by the picture. The doctor rather, had this picture, and it has been stored ever since. Now, there is no signature on it, so apparently these people weren't anxious to have their name known. Now, I understand from what I read in history and what another, it wasn't uncommon for people to be banished to the colonies, so-called colonies of North America, if they weren't acceptable for a period of time socially in their own families. Now, I really don't know anything more about it except it's been cherished. Now, in the fires, there was a certain amount of furniture. Now, we have a walnut buffet that has a quite an extensive burn mark, about 6 inches wide, or more a round burn that had caught fire during the fire and was extinguished. Now we have that, and it's and the old doctor's one of his dining room tables and his set of chairs has been preserved also. The rest of it has, of course, been scattered. Now, what else?
Can you outline a little bit about the Danceys in Ireland itself?
In Ireland itself, we apparently are newcomers in Ireland, 300 or 400 years possibly. Our name, according to the old Livingston family tree, where Dr. Dancey's father is recorded, and his mother, who was Margaret Bell, from the County of Monaghan, and they were named Daneshaw. Now, the word Daneshaw has apparently been transmuted into Dancey. It means, in the Old English version, the man of the wood or the man of the grove. So it's possible that or the man of much hair too. So the estate apparently is referred to as the grove. John Dancey, the grove, of course, was the squire. The Daneshaw part over the time, for some reason or other, has been changed. Now, the Dancey, the E, spelled with an E, is apparently Irish. There are many Danceys scattered over North America without an E, and now they are practically without exception people who came from the British Isles, but mainly England, the southern part, as near as I can understand. Some of these people are in Newfoundland, and of course John Dancey of I believe it's NBC, as an example. He spells his name without an E, but that was the only thing. Now, I was interviewed by a man by the name of Pearl from Detroit area who was tracing his people, and in the dances, who he thought were the same as Dancey's, arrived in Caledonia in 1854. Of course, that's a whole different line, and he was rather surprised that anyone should be in Canada before that time, of course. However, that's beside the point.
What diseases did the Dr. Edward Dancey encounter during his practice?
Oh, they had terrible times. They had cholera, they had diphtheria, and typhoid, and practically anything you wanted to mention. Tuberculosis was present. In fact, his first son, his only son by his first wife, died with it at the age of 18. And it wasn't uncommon, due to the fact that you had to huddle together in small quarters during the wintertime to keep warm, that whole families disappeared or became infected with tuberculosis, and the children were very susceptible, and they died. And diphtheria, of course, and typhoid and whatnot was a thing that they couldn't do much about. There was no vaccination or inoculations that could be used, and they didn't really understand. Of course, severe appendicitis and whatnot was rather difficult too, because it was in later years that they had a suitable anesthetic that they could use, they could diagnose. Now, cancer and severe tumors were fatal. Pneumonias were very, very difficult to handle, because they had very little understanding, actually, of prevention. And as a person became sick, they ignored it, and at the stage where they couldn't do much about it. And of course, mustard plasters and things like that were used extensively. It was heroic treatment, but many people survived, a little scarred, but survived.
What was Dr. Dancey's practice itself like? What type of transportation would he have used, and what type of payment would he have received?
Well, he would get money if he could. Otherwise, he would take what he could get. And apparently, the people, the early settlers, were very honest. They paid when they could, and if they couldn't, they paid in produce or whatever they had. Now, I am of the opinion that the doctor wasn't a very good businessman in collecting and whatnot, because he was well, it's hard to describe him, because he didn't conform to the big money makers. He was more interested in mankind, and he would have to get around in the early days on horseback. And apparently he was a flamboyant dresser at times, because there are recordings in some of the letters that he wore red socks, rode a white horse, and was not averse to stopping at each tavern as he came to it. And he also used a buggy. And there is a story about him of having a bit of Irish. Had a temper that would flare up a bit. And in the early days, one of the most enjoyable occupations there was available outside of playing cards and drinking was trading horses, of course. And he traded horses one evening, and the next day he was coming up the Richmond Hill, which is much different than it is now, and this horse decided it wouldn't go any farther, and in colloquial language, it balked. And there was a team, of course, and two of them on the buggy. It was in the spring of the year, and he had quite a few calls to make, and he was unable to persuade the horse to move, so he got out of the buggy, and he carried a hawthorn cane for some reason or other, and he said a few words, and he whacked it over the head. Well, the horse, to his surprise and embarrassment, just lay down and was dead. Well, he didn't appreciate that too much, so he tied up the whip of tree in the neck yoke and proceeded with one horse, and at the top of the hill he persuaded one of his friends to dispose of the horse and keep his mouth shut. That is hearsay, of course.
Where did he accumulate his property?
Well, he came to be right here. He owned this place and a piece of property next door, and across the street where Hugh now lives, who was, of course, the son of Ernest, my father's older brother. And they also owned a piece of property south of here, just south adjoining, which is the Learn Farm. I think it's owned by Ron Prong now. But of course, I don't know how long they owned that. That goes back in ancient history.
Could you name Dr. Edward Dancey's two wives?
Well, the first wife was Nancy Joyce, and of course she came from Jefferson County, New York, and she died I think in her 30s, and they had 3 children, one of them which was Benjamin, the first Benjamin, and he died at 18 with tuberculosis, as I mentioned. And Aylmer-Malahide was brought here, I believe, in the 1840s, and he went to Jefferson County and brought her back as his bride. She was much younger than he was, but she died at the age of 38 before the doctor did, and I believe that she died of cancer, but I'm not too sure about that.
So which of the children are you descended from?
I'm descended from the second Benjamin of Aylmer-Malahide's son.
And who were Benjamin's children?
Well, he had 2, just Benjamin and Mary married an Anglican minister, and she moved to Minnesota. Now, I'm not too sure what the name was. I should have looked it up for you, but I couldn't find it. But I have talked to her daughters.
What was Benjamin like?
Well, Benjamin was a freewheeler. He was a well-met, very handsome man. Grew up, he's totally spoiled. His father took him with him he's very, very proud of him, of course, and he took him with him in his buggy on his cows, and the doctor was in the habit of stopping at the taverns, had many friends, was well-met, and he would set the boy up, young Benjamin, on the bar and have him water drinks to the house. Well, Benjamin, I guess, thought that should go on forever, but not being a medical doctor with a steady income, he sort of run down in later years, and they had a little problem keeping the property. And my father and my uncle Ernest really had to be the kingpins very early in life.
Could you name Benjamin's children?
Well, I could burn Benjamin's hymns. Ernest was an elder one in Leon, and Jack, who became a medical doctor and lived in Capac, Michigan. He died there about in the 1920s, I believe, after the flu epidemic, after the First War. And Thomas was a drover. He started out as a butcher, and he went to the west. Eventually, he lived in Grand Prairie. He lived in Winnipeg, and he became very, very wealthy in real estate. And then when the war came along in 1914, the real estate sort of went flat, and Thomas was kind of left with a lot of property without any buyers. He then took up his droving business again and started out, and he was in Grand Prairie, and I believe that he died in that area in northern Alberta in about 20 years ago. I think that at that time he was in his 80s, 85 or something like that. He was buried there. Now the daughter married Orrin Ward, who was a local man, and he went to Wisconsin, and they lived there, and I think that she died in her early 30s. She is buried in the cemetery across the street in the old family plot.
Could you describe your father?
Well, my father was a wonderful manager. He was able to have things, do things, and it's hard to understand how with low income and from a farm that you sold your eggs for a few cents a dozen, and you sold your milk, your cream for practically nothing, and yet these people were able to move houses, build them, raise families, put in improvements, build barns, and pay for them, and drill wells. And, for instance, our water supply now was put in by my father in about 1907, and that well is still operating. It was remodeled a few years ago, and a new submersible pump put in, but the original pump was still there and still actually in working condition, in the bottom part of it at least. And the water system was rather interesting because the water was pumped by a windmill up into the barn to a large 1,000-gallon supply tank, and this tank accumulated the water, and then it was by gravity fed back to the house, and of course the water to cattle and so on. And I've always been impressed. My mother had running water in the house since 1907, and by the way, this system cost $1,000 at the time. Now, how they must have been a manager, as I remember. I mean, we always had one or two hired men. We had a big dining room table, and my mother was a wonderful cook. And it would appear from the visits that we had that my father, if he didn't have any stranger at the table, he went out and flagged one down on the highway. Now, I'm a little bit exaggerating here a bit, possibly, but we always seemed to have a lot of people around, and they would come from Western Canada, they would come from Michigan, they would come from various places in Ontario, and they always seemed to be welcome here.
Could you outline your mother's side of the family?
Well, my mother was a Travis, and her mother was a Stratton, and the Strattons were, of course, the original people in Straffordville and in the County Monaghan. They were very, very well respected people who originated in Scotland, and they would, and the Travises were members of a huge group of people who were originally settled in Jamestown in, I believe it was 1628, and the founding of Jamestown, and during that century, or the next century, I believe they owned practically 2/3 of the James Island, and they spread out from there all over the United States. Now, Colonel Travis Alamo was one of them. Of course, there are various of them now, and there are some in California who write. Merle Travis is one of them. He wrote. He is a musician, and he has written some songs, and one of them was owning the company store. Very appropriate. Now, I think, well, I'm sure that in about a few years after 1776, the reason my father's and grandfather's people came across the Niagara River in a heck of a hurry. They were fugitives because they apparently had been accused of libelous feelings. Now, in reading, we find that the War of 1776 didn't really end then, because there were Indian wars, there were reprisals, there were barn burnings, and sort of undercover types of things. And if you were even remotely suspected of being unfavorable towards the new government or the new setup, then you didn't have much of a chance of surviving. And the barns were burnt and the people were murdered, and they just were not good citizens. So they came to Canada. They were generally called United Empire Loyalists. Now, whether they were still a United Empire at the time that the first Travises came, I don't know, but they were a prolific group, because one of them, great, I don't know how great he was or how many greats he had, but he had 33 children, and he had 2 wives. They probably would have more children if the women hadn't given out, but that was a pioneer spirit, apparently.
What was your mother's name?
Of course, Travis, Phoebe. That was a very uncommon name.
And did she attend any schooling?
Oh yeah, she passed her high school entrance, and she had to go to Tillsonburg for high school, of course, and she went there. And how she got there, I presume, was by buggy or probably walking, and they were about, I suppose, 10 or 11 miles away from Tillsonburg in the township of Bain on the Talbot Road. Now, but she did have 2 years of university in Owatonna, in the Pillsbury County, Owatonna, Minnesota. And how that happened was her brother was going to university, and she went along to keep house for it. And also took her courses at the university, and she had 2 years there, which is a wonderful thing for sure.
What type of subjects did she take while she was there?
Well, they took a broad curriculum, because she learned German and mathematics, and I presume about the same thing she did now, because at that time she would be about 16, I think 15 or 16 when she went there, or probably 17, would be 1895, 94, 95, I think.
Can you give us a little history of this house?
Oh, this is a real old house, because it's not too level. You got to weigh yourself. You have to hunt for a level spot, Now, this house was moved here by my father in 1901 when he married Phoebe, and she says that it was a wreck. It was on blocks. Wind was blowing through it and under it and so on. But anyway, they persisted, and it is still here. It is built with barn construction, timbers, 4-inch planks, and even in some of when we remodeled it inside or replaced some of the plaster and whatnot, we found that instead of having 2x4s, there were planks that were split from end to end with the partitions, and some of them were a foot wide at the bottom, or 10 inches at the bottom, and 2 inches at the top, and the other way around. And the good old carpenters were quite strong builders, but they didn't seem to have a level or a plumb rule, because they're never the same distance apart, and the 4x4s they used were, of course, hand hewn, and they pointed up, but never. Some were 30 inches apart, some were 2 feet, and some were maybe more. But however, they're still there, and it looks as though they'll stay for a while.
What was the building originally used for?
Well, apparently there were 2 Methodist churches in the town of Aylmer, and I think they must have joined the forces and became one church, and this was one of the parsonage, probably the worst one, and it was for sale. My father bought it. I don't know what he paid for it.
Could you describe your own education?
Well, I went to high school in Aylmer, and we had to put 5 grueling years in. I enjoyed every minute of it, because if I stayed home, I had to work very hard on the farm, and I must prefer going to school.
So was your summer time taken up with work on the farm?
Yes, we were always busy here. We had a herd of cows, Holstein cows, and we had canning factory stuff and one thing or another, and I don't know, we were busy, but we had to be busy because we had to survive.
Did the war have any effect on your education?
Not really. I was out of school for 6 years. And my father died in 1932, and I had to become a man one night, and mother and I were left alone. My father had put my rest of the family through school, and I was left. My brother was a medical doctor, still going to university in McGill, and my one sister was a nurse, and the other one's a school teacher, and we didn't really have a great deal, but we survived. And after 6 years, I thought that I wanted to become something else, and I decided I'd be a veterinarian. Well, it took a little doing, but in 1938 I did get to university, and I graduated in 1942.
Did you have any military training during your university years?
Why, yes. If you had 2 legs, could go out and do anything, or were warm, when they touched you, you were eligible for the Army. And we had a thing called COTC, which is the Canadian Officer Training Corps, and all university students who were at least partially fit were trained, and I got my second lieutenant's paper, my first, second lieutenant, then the first lieutenant. We wrote our exams, and we went to Army camp and so on, and we wore uniforms. And I have some pictures around here. They always were too big, too small, or something, but however, we survived. But I never was in the active Army, because I had some illnesses and one thing or another that kind of sort of, I don't know, they kept me out of the armed services.
Why did you decide to become a veterinarian?
Well, I really don't know. I can't answer that question, because it was just sort of a natural thing, I guess. 6 years I spent on the farm, I found that if you're going to survive as a farmer in the 1930s, you became sort of an amateur harness maker and a machine fixer and a veterinarian. Our local veterinarian, Dr. Davis, was a wonderful man, and I guess possibly he had some sort of influence on me. And old Dr. Brown, who was an older man that was there, and my wife's grandfather was a veterinarian, one of the first that graduated from the Ontario Veterinary College in Toronto when it was established in the 1860s. So I really can't say any one thing. Now, maybe I thought if I hadn't become a veterinarian, I would have gone to medical school, but I say easier because the Guelph was very close. A strange thing, when I went to university, I was looking back one day and I was thinking, when I realized there was a veterinary college in the world, I didn't know whether veterinarians are hatched out or not. I never thought about it. But when I wanted it, I found it.
When did you begin your own practice?
Oh, in 1942. I was waiting for the Army to call me, and so I had to eat I had a car, and so I bought a few drugs, and I started to work, and I never got along all right.
How wide an area would your practice have covered?
Oh, we practiced from first between the Army Center and New Sarum and down into Bayham, Vienna, and so on, and over towards Avon, up towards Belmont. And it was, we would drive, I think the most I ever drove in 1 year was 36,000, but we'd drive around 28,000 to 30,000. We had to buy a car about every 2 years.
Was there any particular type of vehicle you preferred?
No, just an ordinary car was all that was really available at that time.
Were there many vets in the field at the time?
Oh yes, we had, there were 2 in Tillsonburg, none in Aylmer, but 2 in Tillsonburg and 2 or 3 in St. Thomas varied at times, and then there was one in Dorchester, who was a very active man, and Ingersoll, of course, would come into this area. We had fairly good service. All were fine people.
Did you work alone?
I did until 1948, and Dr. Cressworth came with me, or 1947, Dr. Cressworth came with me, and part-time, and then when he graduated, he worked with me, and then he took over the practice in December of 1949.
Where was that practice located at?
Oh, we ended up I started out on Wellington Street, and now, then I built a house down where Tom Kniff lives at the present time on, I think it's about 405, I believe it is, across from the White Jug. And it was we did everything from there, and Dr. Cresswell, of course, when he first came with us, wasn't married, he stayed with us. We had 4 bedrooms, and we seemed to be quite so darn busy that we didn't have much time for anything else.
Did you do a lot of the drug preparations yourself?
Oh yes, we mixed up a lot of our calciums, our gluconates, and our sugar preparations and whatnot. They were used previously because we couldn't depend on getting them, and we also used a certain amount of the ordinary drugs that I guess my grandfather had used, because that all the things we had available. Now we had sulfanilamide. That was a wonderful thing, and I can remember the first bottle of penicillin that I ever got. I used on a very valuable cow. I think that Adrian Reisman had paid, I believe it was $600 for. I think I paid $12 for the bottle of penicillin, and she was very sick, and it was remarkable, the recovery, and I thought that all our problems had been solved, but it didn't turn out that way.
What did you do when Dr. Cresswell took over the practice?
Oh, I went with the federal government. I wasn't feeling very well. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I passed my medicals all right, but it turned out later that I had low blood pressure developed, and it was very low for quite a few years. And when I joined the service, I was of the opinion, I was sort of, that we wouldn't be moving around the country too much, that we would stay where I was. And that basically was true. My wife stayed there, my house stayed there, but I didn't, because they would always be epidemics and emergencies and whatnot where I could be used, or they wanted me, and I thought that perhaps I'd change my name. Instead of John, I would call myself Available Dancey.
What duties were involved in your job as a federal veterinarian?
Oh, we did tuberculosis testing and general farm inspections for disease and whatnot, and whatever was available. But as time went on, things became more complicated because we had brucellosis controls as well as tuberculosis, and of course, when any exotic disease such as hog collar or foot and mouth disease, anything like that, or Newcastle disease showed up, of course we were on the job to eradicate it.
What would have been your hours during this time?
Oh, well, any time since I graduated, my hours have been 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. We rarely on call.
Could you describe the times that you were taking it out of Ontario or taking special places to combat a disease?
Well, I think the first time I went was sort of a shocker to me. I really didn't expect to go, but they wanted people in Nova Scotia to do tuberculosis testing, and they asked me if I would go, and at the time I didn't want to go, but I considered that I hadn't been on the job very long, and it would be possibly, if I wanted to stay on the job, I better go, so I went. And I enjoyed it very much. It gave me an insight into the Eastern people. They have their philosophy of life is much different than ours, and I found them very enjoyable. Now, I did discover very early that if you came from Ontario, you were not considered to be a very good citizen in Nova Scotia. If you came from Alberta, you're a fine fellow. And I got to Alberta later years, I found there's Saskatchewan. I found the opposite, that if you were wanted to be a good citizen out there and well accepted, well, you came from Nova Scotia. You never mentioned Ontario. So, because apparently we people in Ontario have a very poor reputation in the West and the East. I think it has something to do with borrowing money from Bay Street in the early 1900s.
When was your next trip out of the area?
Oh, I think that possibly was in foot and mouth disease outbreak near Regina in Saskatchewan, and I was out there 6 months, and it was a real education. That's when I became a trained in the field epidemiologist, because we had to really be on our toes.
What other trips did you make during your time?
Oh, I was in Prince Albert, and I was in Alberta, and in Calgary, and Natin, and Claresholm, and High River, and so on. And we saw the country. I never did do anything in Manitoba. But one wonderful thing, while I was there, I was able to get into BC, and I got into the northern United States. So I saw Washington, I saw Montana, and the Dakotas, and I would take a week or two holidays after or maybe a month or 3 weeks after my tour, and proceed onward, because after all, you want to see what's the other side of those mountains. They're terrific.
Did your family go with you?
And when it was possible, yes. Not always possible, of course. Kids going to school and sometimes we were out in the wilderness. And now Regina, we rented a house during the foot and mouth disease, and house furnished. The lady let us have it, and I think I paid her, I've forgotten now, about $150 a month, and we were happy as could be.
What animals did you deal with primarily in this area?
Oh, we dealt with just ordinary livestock of cattle, horses, and swine, and so on, and poultry.
How does this compare to present?
Well, there's very little difference as far as the federal government is concerned, because they have to control disease. You'll have to meet the export requirements, and if you're going to be a viable exporting country such as Canada is, we have to now the big corporations, like when I was in charge of Elgin County, I sort of thought that the reason I was here is to look after export. That the Shore Holsteins, and was here at that time, and Don Shore, and Bill Bridges, they were doing a terrific amount of export work, and a lot of that went through our office. And then John Walker was in operation, and he became one of the biggest exporters in North America, I believe, at least in Canada, and he developed his export business during the time that I was in charge in Elgin County, and I don't think actually that there's a great deal of difference, except it's a matter of keeping up with the regulations and meeting the requirements, make sure that our livestock is going to move. Yeah.
Did you notice any major changes in the veterinarian field over the years?
Oh yeah, because when I graduated, we were taught small animals and large animals and bird diseases and everything else, and we were expected to, and we didn't. We're called on to treat all kinds of animals. But as time went on, a specialization took place, and of course, horse practice had always been more or less of a specialized thing. But anyone that was near the racetrack. But in later years, the pleasure horse came along, and the more people went into the race horses, especially harness horses in this area, and they became specialists in that field. The small animal people, of course, had a tendency to build their own hospitals, and they call them clinics more or less now, and they performed a service to the small animal people, who the pet owners particularly, and sometimes if the veterinarian was interested in horses, he had, and but not enough to supply him with a living, he would have a small animal hospital in an urban community, which augmented his income and was a service too.
What could you tell me about the rural life of this area? What has changed over the years?
Well, I think it's gone to pot, because I don't know my neighbors now. They move in and they move out, and we hardly ever get to know them. Now, the people who stay, we do get to know them, but we don't know them well. Our local school has been taken away from us. Our church has disappeared, and we just do not have any reason to get together for the old-fashioned Christmas entertainment that we had at school years ago. Our church suppers and so on are gone, and even the families are gone, and we didn't move around. We stayed here. And as I remarked one time about my many cousins, and I was telling Dr. Cressworth about, we'd pass a place, and I'd say, well, now there's one of my cousins. And so he came back one day and told my wife that I was late to everybody in Township of Bayham, which was not probably true, but wasn't too far off the mark, because in those days, I'm talking about the 1890s, 1895, 1900, and previous to that, before the automobile and the telephone arrived, a man needed a wife. He had to get one within the distance a horse could go at night and get back to be at work in the morning and to help with the chores. And therefore he didn't get away much farther than 10 miles away from home if he was going to get a bride. Therefore there was many of the families became related, and our cousins are innumerable.
How many of the original families from, say, 1875 are left on this road?
Oh, I think that the Summerses and myself are about the only ones. The original people, the Cascadens, and of course some of them now. Hugh Mathis, his mother was a Cascaden. He's here. He's come back here, and there are on down the road the Benners and the Carters and so on. But in my time, they practically have all disappeared. Other people have come in.
In earlier times, what problems were encountered with selling milk in the area?
Well, everything was, before the Carnation Company came to Aylmer, I guess it was a matter of producing cream and making butter and selling it and doing the best you can, because I guess it was the butter and cheese and homemade cheese and whatnot was a barter item. But after 1907, they built the factory, of course, in Aylmer, which was a wonderful thing, and people took their milk there in cans and by Democrats and wagons, and sometimes neighbors would take turns taking it and so on. There was a period after the First Great War. I wasn't very big, but I remember that they decided that they would take the milk in the summertime on Sundays, because there was a certain amount of spottage. It wasn't uncommon to get a sour can of milk back. But along with other things, the religion of that day was pretty fundamental, and Lord built the world in 6 days, rest in the seventh, and somehow delivering milk was considered to be a rest period, I guess, or sin or something, because we secured a cream separator, and we separated milk on Sundays and sold the cream. But that didn't last more than 1 or 2 summers. it was kind of a burden, I guess. Anyway, the religion must have been adapted to the fact that it was a little bit difficult, and they started shipping them up on Sundays, and that disappeared. There was another thing that occurred that you reminded me of it, and that was the temperance pledges that we had in the school. Now, I remember as a little boy going to school, Mrs. Martindale was my teacher, and she was a wonderful lady, and she married Fred Hunt. Did I say Miss Martindale? She married Fred Hunt, and who was a bank manager, George Hunt's father, and they. I don't know whether she was there or later. The people came around and they had pledges. We were to smoke and we must sign these pledges because it was a thing to do. And we had to grow up and be good citizens, and if you didn't drink or didn't smoke, you could be that. And of course we all signed because we wanted to be good citizens and loyal subjects of the Queen and so on. Now, my brother Travis in Montreal, who's a psychiatrist, he's in his late 70s now, was telling me last year about this, and he said, that was a sinful thing to do, because he said, I signed it. He was older, of course, 9 years older than I was, and when he signed it, he would be in his early teens. But anyway, he said, I didn't know what I was doing, and how can you expect a boy of 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 years old to sign his life away? Well, now, that was one of the most ridiculous things I remember of my childhood. And I think it is too. And I've often thought of it, that how could people be so, but it was their belief. It was about the same as separating milk because it was not the thing to do on Sunday.
Could you describe some of the older buildings in the area?
Well, we haven't too many old things left. Our church is gone, and the old Quaker Hall down on the Walker Side Road, the corner of the Walker Side Road is gone. A little bit of the cemetery is left. The Burdick Cemetery across the street is possibly, it goes back to about 1800. Now, the old barn behind the cemetery, which had belonged to me for a good many years, I bought it from the Evans family. I had it about 40 years, and it was made by built by a man named Caleb Burdick, I think. No, it was always a Burdick farm. But the barn is put together with pegs, hand-hewn logs, great timbers in it, and I put a roof on it, one thing or another, but then I sold the farm a couple of years, 3 years ago to Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker came along, and it was in such good condition that he resided it and saved it as a storage building. Now, I believe that I don't think of any other buildings around here that are that old, and really, I've often thought that it should be restored in the original manner, but as a museum piece, but nobody was particularly.
Is there any stories associated with that farm?
Oh, the Burdick, Caleb Burdick, the original owner, was a minister and a teacher, and he had great influence in the community because he was apparently a very, very well-read man, a well-educated man, and he raised quite a family, and we have people in Aylmer who are descendants of him at the present time. And story goes, and this is supposed to be true because my mother tells me this, or told me this, and I don't think that she repeated the truth, but the story goes that they were bringing in their wheat. Now, in the early days, you grew something, you got it inside. You got it covered up quick because you didn't have a lot of time to mess around. And the process with wheat or grain or anything like that was that you got it in and you covered it in your barn, and then it was brought out and it was flailed, and with a flail, which were two pieces of limbs tied together with a piece of leather, and you whapped it around the floor, and then you gathered up what you whapped off of the stalks or the wheat, took it outside and shook it in the wind, and blew the chaff away, and what dropped out was wheat. and that's what you make your flour with. And of course you wouldn't have too many bushels, but then on the hand it was quite necessary to survive. Now the story goes that they were bringing in this wheat on a stone boat, and a stone boat was a kind of a sled because they didn't have wagons early on, and oxen. And they were, a great storm appeared from the west and it clouded up, and it was thundering and lightning. You see lightning flashing, and it was a terrific storm, and they only had part of the wheat in. So Mr. Burdick stood there and looked at it, and he thought it'd be sweet. So he had 3 daughters there at home, and they were busy in the field, and he was helping them. But he stopped to pray that his crop would be spared. And apparently the storm came up very close to his property, sort of skipped over, and they kept right on drawing their wheat, and it was in the barn safely. I don't know if that's any different from the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea or not.
Were you involved with the school board?
Oh, I was on the high school board in Aylmer for about 20 years. I had a little gap in there. I disappeared, then I went back again.
Do you know what years those would have been?
Well, gee, you asked me, it seems rather strange that you should ask me a question like that. It was previous to 1950s, in the 40s, I guess the late 40s, and then in the 50s. Then I was back on, and when we built the additions and when we planned this, I was there at the time they planned the school that is there now, the one that you went to. But I was off the board at the time it was built. But everything was set up all ready to go when the new board came in, because I didn't stay on the board after it became an elected position, because I worked with the federal government, and I wasn't in a position I didn't think.
What other organizations have you belonged to?
Well, I'm a kinsman for quite a few years now. After I left a kinsman, after you're 40 years old, you're no longer able to take an active part in kinsman's young man's club. I joined the Rotary Club, and I was in that for a few years, but due to attendance problems and one thing and being away from much, I didn't think that I was much good to them, so I resigned. I'm a Mason. I've always enjoyed my Masonic career. I'm a past master in a local Masonic lodge in Aylmer, and I'm a 32nd degree Mason. I'm a Shriner and so on.
One thing I omitted to ask you, there used to be a pond in Aylmer.
Yeah.
To the ice house.
That's right. If you remember the map I showed you in the old Atlas, it showed the pond right on Dingle Street where it came in, where the bridge is now. Well, that apparently was that. There was a mill there. Well, that was gone. And at the time, I believe it was in the 50s, Robert McEwen, who built a house right beside mine on Talbot Street, was mayor. And he conceived the idea that it would be a wonderful thing for the town of Aylmer if that pond was put back there. And he manipulated and worked and got a lot of support, and with the support of the provincial government, and it was all slated to go in. And lo and behold, Mr. McEwen, due to ill health, had to drop out of the council affairs, and the next group just threw it out. And it was never developed. And I often thought, oh, what a wonderful approach that would be. It would have been big enough. Now, when I go to Woodstock, I see their lakes there with the little sailboats on them and sailing around. How wonderful it would be. It had a little thing there that people could learn to sail in fairly safe waters, Of course, it couldn't sail very far, but it would have been a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Well, Dr. Dancey, I'd like to thank you for this interview.
Well, you're welcome. I hope that I haven't said anything I shouldn't have said. I think there's a lot of things I have left unsaid because I didn't think of them.